10 years ago this month, many of us watched in awe as people of all ages and classes filled Tahrir Square in Cairo and demanded the resignation of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Midway through February 2011, the dictator resigned after 30 years in power. At the same time, we were told that social media, particularly Facebook, fueled the protests that brought about revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and ultimately Libya. We were led to believe that Facebook was a force for liberation and democratization. Now, this assumption, this declaration, has not held up over time. But the declaration that we were witnessing a Facebook revolution was more than just a misunderstanding about Facebook or media technology in general. It revealed that we did not understand democracy very well either. The protests in Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Syria, and Morocco all quickly followed the December 2010 uprisings in Tunisia that overthrew the corrupt dictator Ben Ali. We still call this moment the Arab Spring, although it didn't really start in the spring of 2011 and didn't really end by the summer of 2011. In fact, the rage and backlash unleashed in 2010 and 2011 continue to this day, as we see the body count in Syria mount monthly with no end in sight. A civil war in Libya raged until 2020, and frankly, life is no better in Bahrain or Morocco. Democracy did take hold for one brief moment in Egypt, but then it collapsed into sectarian chaos, followed by a military coup d'etat. Only Tunisia came out of that moment with something close to a stable democratic system, but Tunisia remains rife with factionalism and its future remains uncertain. In the decades since 2011, we've seen protests and uprisings around the world. Again, not much has changed in any of these countries, some of which are democracies and some of which are not, some of which are infamously corrupt and others of which are not. In all of these cases, organizers and protesters used social media, most often Facebook and WhatsApp, which is of course owned by Facebook, to identify like-minded people and urge them to join the protests. So what really happened in 2011? Why did we come to misunderstand both democracy and social media so profoundly? Well, let's go back to Egypt. On June 6th of 2010, police beat a man named Khalid Said in front of his home in Alexandria. The police told his family that he was involved in the drug trade and that he had died of asphyxiation. Witnesses to the beating disputed that claim and posted YouTube videos testifying to that effect. Soon, autopsy photos of Said's bloody head spread across Arabic sites, English sites, Facebook pages, YouTube pages. People sent the photos to others attached to mobile text messages. So the authorities in Egypt had almost no chance of monitoring all of this communication. Soon, Al Jazeera noticed the rumblings and posted the images. Other international news organizations soon recognized Said's death as well. Wael Gomen, a Google employee based in Dubai, saw the photos and the videos. So he established and helped run a Facebook page called We Are All Khalid Said. The government of Egypt tried to control this story, as it had for similar incidents of brutality for decades. But the presence of the image of Said's bloody body on Facebook, on mobile phones, on YouTube, and on satellite television made that task impossible. Facebook had just recently begun offering its services in Arabic at the time. So, and this is important, no more than 5 million out of 86 million Egyptians subscribed to Facebook in 2011. Look, the entire connected global media system, not Facebook, generated the impression that the government of Egypt was vulnerable and that the protests had reached critical mass, inspiring more people to join them. Ghonim said in a TED Talk that he gave in 2011, it basically gave us the impression, wow, I'm not alone. There are lots of people who are frustrated. There are lots of people who share the same dream. And remember, a lockdown media system like the one that dominated Egypt for most of its post-colonial history severs connections between and among people. The newspapers in Egypt never reported on events and issues that brought the state into ill repute. Television was largely under state control. Police infiltrated opposition organizations. So a more social media system, along with Al Jazeera out of Qatar, certainly served an important purpose in that revolution. More to the point, these uprisings were hardly spontaneous. They had been planned for months by experienced activists. The 2011 outbursts came as something of a surprise. So of course, naive people looked to Facebook and Twitter and they assumed that these were the things that made the difference. Now, this included way too many American journalists and way too many people in the US government at the time, including Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, who embraced the myth of internet freedom as a tool for democracy promotion around the world. They all ignored the specific conditions in Egypt and Tunisia and universalized these movements through the lens of American technology companies. To observers outside of Egypt, We're All Khalid Said seem to have served as a beacon for those who use Facebook to find others willing to make a stand. And that is also what Khomeini thought as well. Khomeini's ability to explain the uprisings to eager journalists meant that many of them gleefully credited Facebook for what became known as the 25 January Revolution. Journalists spent way too much time on Twitter and Facebook already, and they first learned about the uprisings through Twitter and Facebook. So naturally, they assumed that the thing they all do all day must be important. At the heart of the moment, Khomeini, who was as much a member of the global cosmopolitan technological elite as he was an Egyptian, promoted in English a simplistic idea that Facebook had made the difference. Thus, he helped stunt a full appreciation of the deep social, political, and economic roots of the Egyptian revolution. Khomeini told CNN in 2011, "This revolution started on Facebook. I want to meet Mark Zuckerberg someday and thank him personally." But that idea also limited a full understanding of the power of social media itself as part of a larger media ecosystem. We have to remember that content flows from blogs and chat forums to YouTube to Twitter to Facebook to Al Jazeera to CNN to BBC and then back through the system again. It's a huge network. It's a huge lattice. It's a huge spider web. Images and statements are constantly recycled. Each element of the media system influences all the others. So that's one way everyone got social media wrong. They thought Facebook was the thing, but Facebook was a thing, not the thing. But here's the thing. Everybody got democracy and protest wrong as well. A full and measured examination of protests and uprising around the world since 2011 would yield a mixed collection of successes and failures. That's no different from any other set of uprisings in any other 10-year period of the past 250 years. Sometimes people protest, and when they do, they use the communication tools at their disposal. Sometimes they overthrow a government, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the protest is a one-off event. Sometimes a protest is one small step in a long process of cultural and political awakening. Local conditions also vary, as do results, as do the tools that protesters use. It's sad that discussions about protests over the past decade have been locked in a shallow and unhelpful prism. The question of whether social media mattered or not, caused change or not, is ultimately not that important. The use of social media is perhaps the least surprising thing about these protests. What was not necessarily true in 2011, however, is much more true in 2021. Things have certainly changed. Today, unlike 2011, the whole world, except for China, North Korea, and a handful of other places, has access to Facebook. Social media services, especially Facebook, absolutely affect political and social movements, and thus the protests that ensue, and they do so in peculiar and profound ways. Facebook does make it easier to alert many people who have declared a shared interest. Most importantly, Facebook has the ability to convince, perhaps fool, those who are motivated and concerned. Facebook does not, however, take the place or even bolster the hard work of deep political deliberation and organization. The plight of Egypt makes this point clear. During and after the 25 January Revolution, Khomeini and others celebrated the leaderless nature of the uprising. Khomeini himself took great pride in the fact that Muslims and Christians protested side by side. This offered him and many others a vision of a tolerant, democratic Egypt that certainly appealed to many prejudices, including my own. But it wasn't to be. It didn't reflect reality. The reality of the movement that overthrew Mubarak did not match those early hopeful signs. Once again, today, Egypt is ruled by a brutal, authoritarian dictatorship. Weird, uneasy mixture of liberal cosmopolitans and Islamists forged shaky plans for a new government and then held elections. Well, as it turned out, the liberals had only Facebook pages and grand ideas. The only political party that had formally organized for decades, mostly in secret, prevailed. So, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood took control of the government after the elections of 2012. Once in power, the Brotherhood cracked down on efforts to empower Christians and women. By November 2012, Morsi had declared emergency powers and begun to imprison critics and journalists. The violence against Christians continued. Larger, angrier demonstrations against Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood sprouted in 2013. Some of these protests rivaled the size and strength of the 2011 protests. In July 2013, the military, which had been waiting in the wings under the command of General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, took control and brutally cracked down on all elements of Egyptian society that had worked to overthrow Mubarak. Sisi has been in power ever since. Now, here are some things about Facebook that you need to understand as you look back at these moments and as you consider the prospects for empowered democracy in 2021. First, nothing in human history has ever reached the scale of Facebook. More than 2.7 billion people use Facebook regularly, and they do so in more than 100 languages. So 2.7 billion people use Facebook out of 7.4 billion people in the world. In contrast, there are only about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. No other social media service comes close to its reach or power. Second, Facebook amplifies content. By that I mean posts and ads that spark engagement. Well, what sparks engagement? Strong emotions. Puppy pictures, baby pictures, but also images of torture, violence, injustice, real or imagined. That means Facebook can easily energize movements that divide rather than unite people. It's the best machine ever invented to spread anger, hatred, bigotry, conspiracy theories, and distrust for one's neighbors. Third, Facebook is a surveillance machine. Facebook tracks everything we do on our mobile phones and on our computers. It uses all that data to choose which friends will get to see our posts and which posts from which friends we will get to see. And Facebook chooses for us which advertisements for products or political candidates we get to see. Facebook also shares sensitive information with oppressive governments when those governments demand that information. Also, Facebook and WhatsApp groups are very easy to infiltrate, so Facebook turns out to be easy to hijack if you happen to run a state security service for an oppressive country like Azerbaijan or India. These three things, scale, amplification, and surveillance, make Facebook a force that works against democracy. Real democracy demands a sense that all citizens share a common fate, a sense that we are all in this together, and that all citizens are equal before the law and in the eyes of the state. And democracy can't mean that my side of a political conflict always wins or should win. In fact, it means that my side can lose. But I can be just fine with that the next day, trusting that the rules were fair and the process just. I'll just have to work harder the next time. Now, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube can help people find like-minded allies and rally them to fill a square, maybe overthrow a dictator, or, as happened in my own country just last month, can be used to try to overthrow an elected Democrat. Look, we've never had a better tool for motivation than Facebook. But democracy demands more than motivation. Democracy demands deliberation. Democracy demands institutions, forums, practices, norms, and a sense of tolerance that can let dissent bloom, let opposing sides argue and compromise, let people learn from the differently minded without killing each other over their disagreements. Now, here in the United States, we always assume that the rest of the world wants what we claim to have, but don't actually have. A free and open society, a strong democracy, and free and fair elections. We in North America and Western Europe suffer from both technological narcissism and political narcissism. Now, other people should know better. People beyond the United States should know better, but they don't always. Ghanem, from his home in Dubai and later in the streets of Cairo, fell for all that, at least for a while. In 2015, Ghanem gave another TED Talk. This time, he was chastened. He could not infuse his audience with that spirit of optimism or even reverence for technology. Ghanem said, "I once said, if you want to organize a society, all you need is the internet. I was wrong." Ghanem said that the events of 2011 revealed the great potential of Facebook, but it also exposed its greatest shortcomings, he said. The same tools that united us to topple dictators eventually tore us apart. We failed to build consensus, and the political struggle led to intense polarization, he said. Social media only amplified that state by amplifying the spread of misinformation, rumors, echo chambers, and hate speech. The environment was purely toxic. My online world became a battleground filled with trolls, lies, and hate speech. I started to worry about the safety of my family, he said. Now here, Ghanem describes the worst aspect of Facebook in the world. Anti-democratic or violent factions have harnessed its collective power to swarm people with harassment and threats, often actual violence, and is perpetrated against those who would call power to account. Facebook never was that strong a tool for democracy. Now it's a strong tool for those who oppose it. Facebook is a fear machine, and democracy is more fragile around the world in 2021 than it was in 2011. Now, Ghanem offers no easy solutions for the challenges social media amplify, and I'm not here to offer easy solutions either. But he identified them by looking at what happened to Egypt as its Facebook use spiked after 2011, and its hopes for a peaceful, tolerant future faded. Now, it's up to us to find a way to harness the motivational powers of Facebook to build institutions and practices that can sustain real democracy around the world. Democracy is rare and fragile because it's difficult. There's no way to click, share, or like your way to democracy. Shukran.